Hey, what up, team? Welcome to another installment of the EPL podcast, Ethos, Pathos, Eternal Logos. Still working on the introduction, but we're getting there. We're getting closer. We're getting closer. I was thinking that this week that maybe I'll do something like a tagline. It'll be like, I'll present a topic or the topic or something like that. And I'll say, but I've been thinking. Listening to some people do that, you kind of build this rapport with between speaker and audience, and you guys know what's coming, and then, you can say it and that kind of stuff. But it's neither here nor there. Thank you guys so much for coming out as always, for wherever you are. If you're listening to it in your car, if you're listening to it at your desk, when you're, as you're laying down, no matter where you are. Thank you guys as always for tuning in and being a part of this. As always, we are hoping to build on some of the ideas that we've been wrestling with or contending with the last couple of days, couple of weeks or so. And we're doing it essentially live, little editing, all of that good stuff. If you guys didn't catch the podcast before, there were two before this one. The first one was called What is Truth? There's a long introduction about myself, who I am, what I believe in, the perspective that I'm coming from, and did a very, very, very general idea of kind of what the podcast is ultimately going to be about. The second podcast was called Truth and Belief, how they relate, spitballed some ideas about, how I think through, just at the common sense sort of level, and, drawing conclusions based off of what you believe, whether you think it's true, and the positions that you hold. Today, we're going to get a little bit more focus on where we're going with the podcast, and ultimately going to provide a bit of an example of how we're going to be doing this in the future. I think it'd be slightly more easy on myself when there's somebody to discuss ideas with, because it's not just me, and you'll kind of get to see some back and forth, and then I'll sort of implement this thinking about thinking, as I'm kind of trying to call it, process sort of take place. And hopefully that will give everybody some ideas of kind of how I do it, and it'll be a muscle you'll start to use and flex. Just like anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And there are things that we do all the time that we are really, really good at, that we don't even think about. It's just implanted in our subconscious minds. Think about anything. When you're learning to shoot a basketball, when you're learning to skate, at first you have to remember footing. You have to remember how to do this, one leg, this leg. If it's basketball, going straight up, pointing the elbow, release, follow through, all of those things. But once you do it enough times, it becomes a bit of, kind of who you are, and you just do it. It's like walking and running. And so that's what we're going to be doing as we move forward. Just keep that in mind. Just want to do a little bit of a reminder there, but we're not going to linger too long on that stuff. This podcast tonight is going to be about something that I hold very, very near and dear to my heart. And I'm watching the time. The first podcast is a little longer. Second podcast is a little shorter. Again, not worried about time, but I think there might be a sweet spot. So we're also working on that, as well as the introduction. But this is really near and dear to my heart, because I find myself, when I'm having conversations with friends, family, strangers, no matter who it is, ultimately I get back down to this idea. And I think this would be I thought that this would be a really good thing to start with, as I think within the framework of, like I said, moving forward, what we're going to be doing on a podcast on a regular basis. Whenever I'm in conversations with people, be it political, cultural, religious, worldview conversations, philosophy, anything that's contentious, that you find people fall on one side of the issue or the other, issues that usually bring about conflicts and the back and forth of ideas and viewpoints. Ultimately, I think what that is about is the difference, or the relationship, or how we discern between good and evil. That might sound obvious to some people, but I think it's a lot less obvious listening to debates, just normal, regular debate that you might hear when you might go into a bar, or you might be hearing some people argue about or talking about their girlfriend or boyfriend and their relationships. And usually there's going to be something that people are disagreeing about. And ultimately, I ask myself, what are we disagreeing about? Right? Like fundamentally, really, what are we asking ourselves? Because what happens with any particular issue is that these issues tend to blow up in our society. They'll permeate society. Everybody will be talking about it. Celebrities will be talking about it. And it will become, the media will get a hold of it. And eventually it becomes a political topic. And the politicians will go and they'll run campaigns and talk about these topics and what side of the aisle they fall on any of these particular topics. And ultimately, we side or vote on the political candidate that addresses a number of the topics that we find important. Last podcast, I talked about postmodernism. And I think the quote I used was from one of my favorite apologists, John Lennox, where he quotes somebody, I forget exactly the person's name, so forgive me, but says people are only postmodern about things that they don't find as being important. And I think ultimately, no matter what issue it is, where there is potential conflict and tension between ideas and disagreement about which way is better, ultimately it really boils down to is good and evil, morality. How do we know the position you hold on any particular subject is the right one? And how do you justify it, right? Ultimately getting back to belief in truth, right? Some people we'll call it issue X for the sake of, being short with speech. But if you take issue X and you say, I'm for issue X, you're saying that I basically subscribe or I believe that this is the right position to hold on this issue. Now, there's two fundamental places that people go to, right? Is it right in our society to have that thing become policy? That's where the politics comes into place. But I tend to try to get deeper down into the foundation. Something that I've always said, or have been saying for a relatively long time now, is society, laws, and all that we try to accomplish at the political level. Really, we're taking that and hoping that we're planting that in moral or good soil, right? In other words, we hope that the laws that we create are coming from a foundation of good, that the laws that we're creating ultimately should be a reflection of what is moral. And so I find myself in these conversations when we're talking about politics, not getting down to that kind of conversation, because I think that's where people get mostly defensive, which makes sense, right? Because the thing that we believe in the most, or the worldview that we hold, is going to be something that we tend to have pretty close to our chest, right? Because we don't want to find out that we're wrong about that particular belief or whatever that thing might be in our worldview. So we'll hold it pretty close to our chest and we won't talk about it, right? It'll manifest itself in these conversations that we'll have politically or otherwise. But really, that's what we're asking. How do we know that it's good? And if it is good, ultimately, then the conclusion drawn would seem to be the more obvious approach, but it's not, right? And that, again, goes back to, do you even think it's objective? Morality is rooted in something objective, or do you think morality or goodness is rooted in something that is subjective, right? So here's where I want to use this as an example, talk through a little bit of the ideas, show you sort of the way that I think through it. And this will probably be, at this point, the most contentious, right? I have a particular position on this, right? I ultimately want people to think about it, where they sit in their worldview, how they get to these conclusions for themselves, ultimately. But I am going to present a case and present my particular position about these things. So the idea is we're going to take this issue X and say, if a person has, which I think that I don't think, at least at the highest level, the highest level or the most foundational level, I do believe, because I'm a believer, that morality can be rooted in objection in the objective realm. That is for me as a Christian to say that I believe that goodness and morality is reflected in the nature of God in some sense. I won't get too far into that, but the reason that I hold this particular position, so that's my worldview. That's what I believe. That's what I think is true. So now I'm going to kind of explain a little bit why I think that is the case. So you might say, let's take issue X and let's say, I think that issue X is good. And that's where I sit. My belief, my position, my values, and got me to say that issue X is a good thing. Ultimately, I say, you may ask me, so, okay, so how do you believe, or why do you think that issue X is good? How do you justify it? And I say, well, I believe that issue X is good because I believe that ultimately God says that this thing is good. I take that more basic idea or principle and I extract and I get to a place where it starts to coincide with whatever that issue might be, right? So if I say, killing is wrong, let's say issue X is killing. I say, well, God says it's wrong to kill. And therefore, the stance that I have on issue X is I think that we shouldn't kill in society, right? At a very basic idea, very basic, understanding kind of what we're discussing here. Without the myriad of different things, just at a very, very basic level, let's just hold that and say that's where my position on it is. Now, somebody might take issue with my worldview. They might say, well, I don't believe in God. Okay, no problem. The point of me telling you sort of my position, my beliefs, and my values isn't to say that I think you should believe in God. It's just to say, well, that's how I justify, how I ground that moral principle that I hold that killing is wrong, right? And somebody might say, well, why is that justification for saying that killing is wrong? It's a good question. And what I like to say is, well, if you can put yourself in the place of a believer, I believe that God is real. So if God is real, then that means you have to start to consider, what do I mean by God and the nature of God? So ultimately, in a very, very simple way, I believe that God is the creator of the universe. Let's just say, take that quality. God created the universe. Therefore, God decides what is good because he created the universe, everything in it, even morality. Right? Now, you can go down a rabbit hole and say, well, did God also create evil? Good question. I won't go down. We can bring that up in a later. If you are interested in that, comment that below. Let's talk about that for sure. But let's just hold the position currently at the moment that I say I ground my belief that killing is wrong in God. And how do I justify it? Well, God created the universe, so God gets to determine the qualities or the principles of the universe. And because of that, I rest on that foundation is justified in saying that, well, God said so. Now, it's an authoritative or a theonomous culture or a theonomous thought. But again, remember, with just staying in what we're talking about, we're simply trying to ground, or we're trying to justify why. Now, here's why it's justified. And here's the analogy. I like to give this analogy quite often. God is the owner, or the creator and owner of the universe that he created, right? The analogy is, let's say you own a home or you are renting an apartment. So you're the one responsible for it. So whatever you decide in your home is good for the home, that's what it is. Let's just say we're talking about me. I own this home. When people come into my house, I ask them to take off their shoes. That's a good principle that I've set up in my home, right? So when someone comes over and asks them to take off their shoes, it behooves them to respect that which is mine, right? That's partly, ultimately, the the idea of property and, why we should respect it, because it's coming from the authority of the person who actually owns it, or whose it belongs to, essentially. And so that's the analogy to God, right? God owns the universe the same way we own our homes and our property. And so we, as the owners, and obviously with God, you can take that far further, because he's not just the owner, but the creator. He determined a lot of those things. But if you can just at that level understand it, like, well, this is my house, so you have to listen to what I say, right? So it's not to say, again, whether you believe in God or not, but it is simply just to say that it's justified if God is real, right? I believe he is, so that's my justification. That's how I argue from point A to point B. On the flip side, if you are postmodern, and we talked about that in the last podcast, if you rather think that morality exists only in the subjective, that is to say, that morality is determined by human beings in the human mind, which ultimately, I guess if you were a naturalist, is the belief that it ultimately is a result of the brain, which is matter. We won't go down that road. We're not talking about people who might be naturalists or materialists necessarily. We're just talking about people who might hold the view that that morality, good and evil, exists subjectively, and there's no objective nature or no objective grounding to it. The problem that I see with that is very fundamental in nature. Now, we'll think through it a little bit more, but ultimately, the basic idea that goes through my mind is to say, well, if you think, let's just say you take the con to issue X. Let's just say you think, before I said issue X could be killing, but let's just take it back to just a generic issue X. If you take a position on issue X and you say, I believe that issue X is right or good. If ultimately what you're saying is, well, the philosophy that I hold, the thing that I believe in is that morality is subjective. If you argue from your philosophy there, or your worldview, and you say, I take the position as a result of my worldview that issue X is good, then you have to think, okay, well, if morality and goodness is subjective, and you believe that subjectivity comes from the human mind, then what makes your opinion, because then it would be an opinion, good and evil will become an opinion. What makes your opinion about issue X right? Because there's other people out there that would disagree with you, and they're also human, and they're also equal. If you believe human beings are equal, what makes your position on issue X correct? In other words, you then have to justify why your position is better. Because when you get rid of that objective sort of obligation, that's what the objective world does. It forces, or it obligates subjective beings, regardless of how the subjective beings might feel. The issue in subjectivity is, if you believe that it's subjective, then that means that one day you can feel one way and another day you can feel the next way. And that would be consistent with your philosophy, because if you're saying that ultimately I think that good and evil is subjective, it exists in the mind of human beings, and human beings' minds change over time. Sometimes people's minds change within minutes or seconds, right? Even now, someone listening to this podcast might hear what I'm saying and it might make sense. And now they might go from being a subjectivist to an objectivist, just like that, right? And so the question gets deeper for someone who, or at least more explanation is now required. There's a lot more complexity and things to think through. But this is what I like to say. I say, well, if you believe that morality and good and evil is subjective ultimately, then to some degree, you're giving up, and this may be a contentious point, to some degree, you're giving up the ability or the right to criticize anyone else for their perspective or their worldview or their position on issue X or on any issue. Because again, they're equal, they're human, and they may have evolved differently, or they may have another perspective on it that might get them to a different conclusion about issue X than you did. So this is one of those things that, again, I think becomes an issue of, it sounds great in theory, right? Because ultimately when people say, people I think are trying to be tolerant to some degree, which I can appreciate, right? I think I'm an extremely tolerant person, even though I do believe that morality and many things about our universe are black and white. I don't think that the gray doesn't exist, but I think the gray exists sort of in a subjective world. But good and evil, or other issues that might be tantamount to good and evil, exist black and white, right? So I operate at two levels. But this is one of those cases where it sounds great in theory, right? And again, I appreciate it. I do appreciate the fact that people are willing to give people autonomy, right? To say that you have the right to be free and act as you feel fit for your well-being, etc. But you run into some major issues, and a lot of the debate out there that is taking place is about this sort of thing, is having a subjective viewpoint on these things enough to get people to act a particular way, or to request, rather, I think that's probably the nicest way to say it, or even force, or give people enough reason to act in a particular way, or change or persuade them from the counterpoint or the counter idea. Again, sounds great in theory, but ultimately, is it practical? Can it be pragmatic? It is to say also too that, and you may have heard this before, but you can't go from an is to an ought, right? The ought definitionally can kind of sort of be the what if land, the should be this way. And human beings, which is very interesting in my mind, are capable of sort of coming up with paradise in thought, right? Or it would be perfect if, or we should do this. But ultimately, sometimes that doesn't mean that you can get from that to practice to the real world, right? And that's where I tend to jump off that boat a little bit, right? Because it's to say that, like, if we have an idea of the way things ought to be, but we have to take into account the way things are, because that's natural, right? That's the way that the chips seem to fall. And that has to be a part of the whole system, right? So having that subjective position, in my mind, will get you into situations where you'll find yourself compromising on your own more basic philosophy, principle, or worldview. And that's why I don't hold it, because I think it's inconsistent. And I think inconsistency means that there's some flaw, and where there's some flaw, it can't be truth in sort of this ultimate sense. Now, you might not think that ultimate truth exists in that sort of way, but that's another topic for a different conversation at a later date. But think about that tonight. Think about that when you're having a moment. Write down some ideas. Please comment on if you heard anything that made sense, if something didn't make sense, or you think that what I'm saying you take issue with at any point. Because again, I'm interested in discussion. I want the discussion, but I really want people to, think about this. It's not trivial. It's not obvious. if you think, in my mind, if you think it's obvious, I think that's naive to a degree, right? Like we have to really think about these ideas and understand why we think this. And is it true? And is it consistent? And is it rational? Does it make sense? And do you oftentimes in your life finding yourself compromising? Once you understand exactly what your philosophy is and what you believe in, do you find yourself compromising on that philosophy and that belief when faced with certain situations, when challenged? Does it hold water? Does it not? And I think if you find yourself doing that, then I think either the philosophy needs to be adjusted or you need to adjust your conclusion. So that's another installment, you guys. Thank you again for coming out, for participating, for commenting, for liking the video, for listening to me ramble for 26 minutes and 5 seconds at this point. And I appreciate you. Like I said, comment, subscribe to the channel if you want to. Don't subscribe to the channel if you don't want to. But let's talk about it. Let's think about these ideas. I appreciate each and every last one of you. God bless you. Sorry for getting to this posting late. I'm going to try to be better. But I am doing one a week, even though if they're a little late. So we'll definitely be back. We'll definitely talk more about this idea. This will certainly come back up. But hopefully that example gave you guys a depiction of what we're going to be doing in the future and how we're going to be thinking through things and thinking about thinking. Thank you once again. I appreciate you. Have a fantastic night.